Hello, I'm Bret and you're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Our guest today is Dr. Alexander Shaia. Dr. Shaia is the author of Beyond the Biography of Jesus, The Journey of Quadratos. Dr. Shaia holds a PhD in clinical psychology and is an educator, spiritual director, professional speaker, and founder of the Blue Door Retreat in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Dr. Shaia is the son of Lebanese Christian immigrants. He grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Alexander Shaia, welcome back to The Defining Moment. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome you back here to our studio today.
It's a delight to be back. Thanks, you, Bret.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Our topic today is, what would Jesus do to save Christianity from its moral crisis? And I'd like to begin by asking you to share a defining moment from your own life.
As you just so beautifully said in that introduction, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I grew up in Birmingham in the 1950s, which is a particularly difficult time in that city's history. I am the son of Lebanese immigrants. And I grew up in really a Lebanese village in the middle of Birmingham, Alabama. And it's hard to believe, even as late as the 1950s and the 1960s, that village would have continued to exist. But it existed because there was so much oppression and persecution in Birmingham for those of us who were immigrants and Catholics. So the moment for me is 7 years old. It's a spring night, and we get a phone call. And all I know is my parents put me in the back seat of the car and we race a couple of miles away to my grandmother's house. Now, grandmother in Arabic is Sitto. Sitto's house. She's the heart of our family. She's where all of our family gathers every Sunday of my life until I went to college. We would have dinner at her home. When we arrived, there is police tape everywhere. And fire is bursting out the windows and the doors, and there's that acrid smell in the air of burning wood. And we stand there and we watch the entire house consumed, and we do not know where our Sitto is. And what's even more concern is that she walked with a crutch. She had an accident earlier in her life, and she could not move very quickly. So in essence, as we stood there, we thought perhaps that we were watching her funeral pyre. Many hours later, she drove up. She'd gone out that night. A friend had dropped by, put her in the car, taken her out for a beautiful spring evening drive. But as the fire cooled, we discovered even more horrific evidence. Someone had broken into the home, had gone through it and collected all the mementos from the old country, from Lebanon, put them in a pile in the living room, gone back through the house, and this time collected everything that seemed or appeared Catholic. The statues and the rosaries and the crucifixes, and put that on the pile in the living room. And then on top of the entire pile, they added the family Bible. They then had doused that area with kerosene and thrown kerosene around the house and lit the match and fled. The days following that horrendous night were angry and bitter and resentful. And there was much discussion of getting back and getting even. And 5 days later, we were in another dining room with my grandmother after Mass on Sunday. And on this day, as we sat at cardboard tables and plywood tables and folding chairs, and my grandmother was in the center of the room with her sons and daughters at the center table, and we were all waiting for what she would say. And after she said grace, she kind of looked down and her glasses slid down her nose and she looked out over the room. She looked, I think, at every person in the room. And then she spoke these words. She said, no hate. No hate. We move forward. No hate. And in that moment, 7, 8-year-old, I said, I want to know where she gets that strength. And what was also evident is that in that moment, she changed our family. All the anger and the acrimony and the bitterness that I'd been hearing for days, it was gone. And the family lifted itself back up and we moved forward. And I've never forgotten that moment. And I hope that in many ways, my life and my work is about what I learned from her. That we're all humans, we're all together, we're all trying to serve God in our own ways. And there's just not enough time for hate and acrimony and bitterness.
Wow, that is so profound, so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Considering the enormous and complex challenges facing humanity at this time, how would you characterize Christianity's moral crisis?
Small question.
Yeah.
My concern today, in part why I've written this book, is that there's a void in the center of Christianity, and it's growing larger. One of the parts of that void is what happens to a people and what happens to a great spiritual tradition when it loses the core story. And the first piece of what's happening in Christianity today is that the core story of the Gospels has unfortunately become either an academic discourse or it's become a study of flat words. And in essence, everything that I know from my Semitic upbringing, and I use the word Semite because all the settled peoples of the Middle East are Semites, which means the village dwellers, as different from the nomadic Arabs that came up out of the desert. We share a culture, and that culture is that our great texts were composed for prayer. In essence, they were composed for prayer as chant. And as you know from the Middle East, one of the spiritual practices of the Middle East is chanting. And that when you take the great story and you chant it, something different happens than just reading it or studying it or putting concepts into your brain. That it begins that long journey from the head to the heart. And when the grace or the vitality moves down into the heart, then people are compelled by a spiritual practice, which is not just an ideology. And the spiritual practice is about how to draw together, how we can be, the core piece for all of us today is how are we going to be a diverse world that celebrates and recognizes diversity and yet draw together on our common values so that we are not fighting over the names of God, but we're falling in love with deep spiritual practice. And as the core story of Christianity is dwindling by one side that wants to treat them as an academic discourse and another side that wants to see them as simply historical words, we're losing the heart of Christianity, which is the spiritual practices of prayer and transformation. And so that's what I mean by the void today. The void is that it's in the very center of the Christian tradition across all of our churches. And this last year and a half, I've had the honor and the privilege and the challenge of going across all of Christendom and speaking everything from Methodist and Presbyterian to Disciples of Christ to Lutheran and Episcopal and Roman Catholic. And the void is happening right in the middle of all those traditions, because we are choosing to battle over names rather than fall in love with spiritual practice.
Okay, very clear. Thank you very much. Many Catholic and mainline Protestant churches, like the ones you've mentioned, have become like old folks' homes in many ways, and Catholic seminaries are disappearing. There's a shortage of Catholic priests worldwide. Why is Christianity losing the battle to save the youth from the immorality of popular culture?
One of the first things that will happen as we restore the Gospels as the path of spiritual practice is that we'll come to understand through the Gospel of Matthew that everything is change, that there is no such thing in the universe or in Christianity as stasis. The moment that you choose to just lock it down and say this is the way it's always been and this is the way it always will be, then the life and the vitality is gone. So one of my great heroes is Pope John the 23rd from the late 1950s and the early 1960s, who said we've got to open the windows of the church and let the breezes come back in. Who knew that for my tradition to be eternal means that it must always be in the process of change. Now the question of change is how much, what's good change, what's not good change, but we as a tradition cannot stand against the world. We cannot say that technology and science are in and of themselves evil or not of God. We've got to move and embrace the world and discern from within it what's helpful and creative, what builds up communion, and what's of disharmony and dis-ease and injustice. So when I look at the next generation, and I already am not that old, but I'm looking at the generations coming after me, and I realize they've got a life experience which is not mine. And I'm not going to be in that world. My concern is how do we move them to a world without fearing it? How do we help them, how do we help give them the core values to embrace change and continue to see God's moving spirit in our life? And I mean, that it's so easy to say, it's so hard to do. But the first thing that concerns me is when much of the Christian tradition today just looks out at the enormity of change and fears it, or says that this level of change cannot be of God. Well, as we talked about in the other show, if the universe is moving by the breath of God, then much of what we're discovering has also got to be of God.
Okay, very clear. Thank you so much. According to your understanding of the Gospels, if Jesus were with us here today, how would he deal with the way in which Christianity continues to divide the body of Christ, Catholic and Protestant?
Well, first of all, Bret, in my belief, Jesus the Christ is here today. And Jesus the Christ is using the text of the Gospel of John, which was written initially and has become the eternal verity for Christianity. It's precisely the gospel of this question. Because the experience of joy and union is so strong and so ecstatic, it has a downside. And the downside is the experience of division. When I confuse the way that I receive the joy in the union with thinking that this is the way that everybody must receive the joy in the union. In that gospel, the first 2 chapters give us that ecstatic bursting forth of the heart with the experience of communion with God. Starting with the 3rd chapter through the 11th chapter, passage by passage, the text gives us Jesus the Christ talking to us today, talking to the Nicodemus in us today. The Nicodemus voice in that gospel is the voice that confuses. I mean, we have this great text about how can somebody go back into the mother's womb and be reborn? Essentially what that's saying is, in Nicodemus's mind, how can someone go back into a Jewish mother and get Jewish blood? Because without Jewish blood, you do not have the right to know Yahweh. And Jesus' response to Nicodemus is, God can raise up faith from stones. Don't give me the discussion of natural law when it comes to spiritual reality. And so we have the great story of Nicodemus, we have the woman at the well, we have the man born blind, we have the raising of Lazarus, chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter. And in each one of those chapters, Jesus the Christ is speaking to us today and saying, stop the argument about ritual form. Go to the place of spiritual practice. Go to the life that comes out of that practice. Look at the result of the fruit, not the fruit. You shall know the truth by the result. If your result is you're bashing each other over the heads for names and ritual forms, you're moving away from the harmony of God. If the result is that you're deeply using your spiritual practice to come to understand the one God who holds us all and brings us into a place of love and harmony and reconciliation, even in the midst of our diversity, then you're moving in consort with the one breath of God. One of the things that I've discovered as I've moved around the United States this past year and been with so many Christian denominations is the walls and the categories between all those churches are coming down. People are coming home to a common experience of God. Now, I'm Roman Catholic, and I'm a devout, and in my face, a fierce, loyal, and joyous Roman Catholic, because my tradition provides me the best way that I know for me to be home with my God. But so I have to believe that what I'm experiencing as I go out and I'm with my Presbyterian and my Episcopal and my Lutheran and my Methodist brothers and sisters is we're all worshiping the same God. And Jesus the Christ did not come to have us be part of a monolithic one way to God. It's profoundly in the Gospel of John that Jesus the Christ came to say that spiritual practice would be the basis of what it means to be Christian. So I think that Jesus today is both excited at the way that the traditions have drawn closer together and perhaps a little sad and a little weary of some of the less than essential arguments that we have with each other.
Okay, very, very well said. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Many Christians have all kinds of attitudes about the validity of other faith traditions besides Christianity. What would Jesus' attitude be toward taking responsibility to achieve lasting mutual respect, harmony, and peaceful cooperation among the world's religions?
again, for me, back to the great name, Jesus the Christ. The Christ being the breath of God that was planted into the universe before the first moment of creation. And Jesus being the fullness of that manifestation and that revelation. My great teachers, through the Second Vatican Council of my tradition, talked of the fact that all people of faith who believe that there is one Creator who calls us to be responsible to the Creator and responsible to each other is the definition of church. And outside of that, quote unquote, there is no salvation. So within that definition of church, if you believe that there's a Creator God who calls you to be accountable to the Creator and accountable to each other, from indigenous faiths through the great, beautiful, high ritual churches that we know, we're all seeking to serve that one source. So I find that the future will be world religion that engages in conversation about spiritual practices that build up love, that build up forgiveness and reconciliation, that build up just ways to take care of the poor and the earth and those with no voice. Those are the conversations that I'm looking forward to increasing. And I'm looking forward to sharing with my brothers and sisters who have different forms of ritual. I'm secure in what's the best way for me. But what's the best way for me is not necessarily the best way for you or for someone else.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. In your view, what would Jesus say about the fact that because of the way Christians worship, Sunday is the most racially divided day in America?
First of all, I think that Jesus is saying that church continues to be a place that we are not just racially divided, but we are divided at every level. Our churches largely have become places where we gather with like, whether it's like in terms of poverty, or like in terms of wealth, or like in terms of skin, or like in terms of theological expression. That our churches have become a bit homogeneous communities. And that's a difficulty. I want to recognize that we've come a huge way in 50 years. I want to recognize that that divided America in Birmingham, Alabama in 1950 is no more. That Birmingham is gone, and largely that America is gone. So if I'm looking at the progression, we're moving today to a world that's filled with more respect, more mutual acceptance of diversity, and more integration than we've seen in a couple of hundred years, if not on the face of the planet. So we're just living through the birth pains of a larger time when, yes, there will come a day next year, 20 years from now, when our Christian churches will be more integrated, when all of our churches will be more integrated, because we are falling in love with each other again, as we fall in love with our one God.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. What message of hope about the future of Christianity, based on the Christian Gospels, would you like to leave with our viewers today? There is a quote by Martin Luther King
in his famous Letter from a Montgomery Jail, composed in December of 1957. The quote means a great deal to me because it was shortly after that I stood outside of my grandmother's house burning. Martin Luther King said, he wrote this as his sermon to be read in his church on Christmas morning. Send your hooded perpetrators into our neighborhoods at the midnight hour. Burn our homes, break our bones, hurt our children, and we will not hate you. We cannot in good conscience obey your unjust laws. We will win our freedom. But when we win our freedom, we will have so appealed to your heart and to your conscience by our ability to suffer that when we win our freedom, the victory will be twofold, for we will have won yours as well. If we believe as Christians in the risen Christ, we have no reason for anxiety. The future, tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now, will always have more union, more communion, more respect, more justice than today. Each generation is simply challenged to live the words of Martin Luther King. We all have places in our families and in our civic communities and in our religions and in our world where we want more justice. That's just simply our burden to bear for the next generation. But we must do it from his sense of equanimity and hope.
Okay, well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for having been our guest today on The Defining Moment. It's really been a pleasure to have you here today. I want to give you a chance to share with our viewers how can they get a copy of your book, Beyond the Biography of Jesus.
Thank you. Any bookstore, independent bookstore, large chains accept orders. Also, you can get a copy by going to Coldtree Press or Quadratos.com. If you go to Quadratos, we can also get the book signed with an inscription for a friend or a neighbor as a gift.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having been our guest today.
Thank you, Bret.
Appreciate it. You've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. You can find us on the internet at www.definingmoment.tv. Thanks for watching and have a great day.